Angela Williams sat quietly in the courtroom, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. The room was stuffy, and the soft murmur of voices around her seemed distant. She had tried to explain the situation to Judge David Harris, but he wasn't listening. It wasn't the first time she'd felt overlooked, but today it stung a little more. She was a school teacher, an ordinary woman by all outward appearances, but her life had been anything but ordinary. For years, Angela had fought against bullying and exclusion, using her voice to help shape national policies to protect students from the very things that had plagued her own childhood. She wasn't just an educator. She was a leader in a growing campaign aimed at making schools a safer, more inclusive place for all students, no matter their background. But today, in the small-town courtroom, none of that mattered. Angela had been summoned here for a workplace infraction, a minor miscommunication regarding a procedure at her job that had resulted in a fine. It was nothing major, but the way it had been handled felt personal. She had been late submitting a report, a mistake she had already rectified. Yet the judge, a man of considerable age and traditional views, seemed unmoved by her explanation. "Miss Williams," Judge Harris said in his deep, steady voice, his eyes not meeting hers, "I don't care about your excuses. The law is the law. You will be fined $200 for your negligence." Angela's stomach tightened. She had hoped for a bit of understanding, perhaps some leniency, but his tone was final. There was no room for empathy here, just the cold, rigid application of rules. She took a deep breath, trying to mask the disappointment that swirled inside her. She had spent so many years fighting for fairness, for justice, only to be met with this impersonal judgment. As she left the courtroom, the weight of the fine seemed lighter compared to the weight of the moment. It wasn't just the money, it was the feeling of being disregarded, of not being seen for all the work she had done to help others. As she walked past the courthouse steps, she didn't notice the camera crew setting up nearby. The world outside the courthouse, unaware of Angela's life's work, would have no idea that she wasn't just an ordinary teacher. They wouldn't see her as someone whose tireless advocacy had helped shape the future of countless students across the nation. All they saw was a woman in front of a judge, facing the consequences of an insignificant mistake. But that was about to change. Angela took one last look at the courthouse before stepping into her car. Today may have been a setback, but it would not define her. She was more than a fine. She was a force, and the world would soon find out. Angela Williams had never sought the spotlight. Her work in anti-bullying advocacy had always been about giving a voice to those who felt silenced, empowering students and teachers to stand up for what was right. Yet few outside of her close circle knew the extent of her involvement. To most, she was just the dedicated teacher at Woodland Hills High School, known for her passion in the classroom and her unwavering belief that every student deserved to feel safe. But there was much more to Angela than her role as a local educator. For over 5 years, Angela had been at the helm of the National Bullying Prevention Campaign, a federal initiative aimed at reducing bullying in schools across the United States. She had worked closely with lawmakers, school boards, and mental health professionals to advocate for comprehensive anti-bullying programs that focused on both prevention and intervention. Her efforts had been instrumental in shaping policies that would later become laws that protected students not just from physical bullying, but from the emotional and psychological harm that came with exclusion, isolation, and verbal abuse. Her work, though impactful, had always been behind the scenes. Angela had built coalitions, organized conferences, and even collaborated with celebrities and public figures to raise awareness. Yet, despite the national recognition, Angela always preferred to keep her identity low-key. She believed that the cause was bigger than any one person, and the real success lay in the systemic changes that were happening across the country. She never sought accolades, never craved recognition. Her fulfillment came from knowing that countless children were walking into safer schools each day because of the work she and her colleagues had put in. Her days were filled with phone calls to government officials, meetings with nonprofit leaders, and countless hours of paperwork, work that many never saw. She had developed school programs that trained teachers on how to spot bullying early and provided resources for students who felt isolated. Her approach was holistic, involving not just teachers but also parents and the wider community, making sure the message of kindness and inclusion resonated everywhere. Angela also spent weekends traveling to schools, speaking directly to students and sharing her own experiences with bullying. Her journey had been difficult, growing up in a tough neighborhood where bullying was rampant, but it had shaped her into the resilient leader she was today. Her message to the kids was simple: you matter. You are not defined by the cruelty of others. Despite her powerful work, Angela never sought to put herself in the limelight. She stayed focused on the mission, believing that if the work was done right, the changes would speak for themselves. But now, as news of her court case began to circulate, she realized that the world was about to learn something they hadn't known about her. A truth that might shift how people saw her, and possibly how they saw the issue she had spent her life fighting for. It didn't take long for the story of Angela's courtroom appearance to spread. What started as a local case quickly became the subject of national news. A reporter, intrigued by the name of the woman involved in such a minor infraction, decided to dig deeper. As the journalist made calls to the local school board and several community leaders, they uncovered something that would change everything. Angela Williams wasn't just another teacher. She was a powerhouse behind a national movement, quietly shaping the educational landscape. The reporter found articles, interviews, and even legislative papers that chronicled her pivotal role in the National Bullying Prevention Campaign, which she had been leading since its inception. The organization, which Angela had helped build from the ground up, was now one of the most influential in the country, impacting hundreds of schools nationwide. When the reporter's story broke, it caught everyone off guard. Headlines read, "Local teacher fined for minor infraction. Turns out she's behind national anti-bullying campaign." Social media exploded with comments and reactions. People began to question how a woman who had dedicated so much of her life to protecting children and advocating for inclusivity could be treated so harshly over a small technical mistake. The public reaction was swift and intense. Many felt that the fine was excessive and unfair, especially given Angela's credentials and tireless work to make schools safer. News outlets across the country began to highlight her work, interviewing colleagues, students, and activists who all praised her commitment to the cause. The focus of the story quickly shifted from a simple court case to a discussion of whether Angela had been judged fairly or if there were deeper biases at play. The backlash against Judge Harris was also immediate. People began to ask how a judge could have failed to recognize Angela's contributions when making his decision. Some pointed out that Angela's background, her race, and her leadership role in the anti-bullying movement might not have been fully considered in his judgment. Others debated whether it was fair for a judge to apply the law so rigidly without taking into account the broader context of someone's character and impact on society. As the media frenzy intensified, Angela found herself both uncomfortable and empowered. The spotlight was not something she sought, but she realized that this unexpected attention could give her an opportunity to advocate for something much larger than the fine she had received. If the public could see her work for what it truly was, a genuine effort to protect and uplift vulnerable kids, perhaps it could spark a broader conversation about fairness, empathy, and the way people are judged in our society. For Angela, this wasn't just about a courtroom moment. It was about a chance to turn the conversation toward the very issues she had spent years fighting to address. What had begun as a frustrating personal setback was now transforming into an unexpected platform for change. The media storm surrounding Angela Williams only grew stronger as the days went on. What had begun as a local story about a small fine had exploded into a national conversation about fairness, social justice, and the impact of a single individual's work. Across social media, hashtags like Justice for Angela and Fighting for Kids trended, and it wasn't long before Angela became a household name. Her face, once familiar only to those in her community and the education sector, was now on TV screens, in newspapers, and all over online platforms. The more people learned about Angela's background, the more astounded they were. The revelation that she was the force behind the National Bullying Prevention Campaign shifted the entire narrative. Angela's role in shaping anti-bullying policies had changed the way schools across the country handled conflict and supported students. She wasn't just advocating for minor adjustments. She had helped push for legislative changes that ensured schools had stronger policies to combat bullying and provided teachers with better resources to handle emotional and psychological bullying. Her work had touched the lives of millions of students, and her influence had reached all the way to Capitol Hill. What truly shocked many was that despite her impressive credentials, Angela had remained so under the radar. She had never sought fame or recognition for her contributions. Angela had always believed that the work itself spoke louder than any accolades could. But now, with the media spotlight on her, the public couldn't help but question how such a vital leader had slipped under the radar for so long. As Angela's story spread, the impact of the judge's decision became more apparent. People began to wonder if the fine, imposed without full understanding of Angela's significant work, reflected a larger issue of how society undervalued certain contributions, especially those from people in underrepresented communities. Many noted that if Angela had been a well-known politician or public figure, her work would have likely been acknowledged in the courtroom. Instead, her quiet dedication had been dismissed, overshadowed by a technicality that no one seemed to think was worth examining further. In a series of interviews, Angela's colleagues from the National Bullying Prevention Campaign spoke about her passion, her unwavering commitment to the cause, and the lengths she had gone to ensure that every child had a safe space to learn. They described how Angela often worked late into the night, answering emails from teachers in remote areas, offering advice and support to parents struggling with their own children's bullying experiences. She was a constant source of encouragement and empowerment for everyone around her. The more people learned about Angela, the more the narrative shifted. The judgment that had initially seemed like a simple legal decision now appeared as a larger symbol of a deeper systemic issue. What had started as a minor inconvenience for Angela had turned into an important conversation about how we value the work of everyday heroes. Angela didn't just want justice for herself. She wanted to use her newfound platform to advocate for everyone who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to make a difference in the world. And as the world began to learn her story, Angela found herself at the center of an unexpected movement. Judge David Harris sat in his office, a sense of unease settling over him as he scrolled through the articles about Angela Williams. He had never imagined that his decision in a simple courtroom would spark such an uproar. What had seemed like a minor case to him had now become the focal point of a much larger conversation, one he hadn't anticipated. The more he read, the more the weight of his actions began to sink in. Angela Williams, the woman he had so swiftly fined for a minor infraction, was not just another schoolteacher. She was a respected leader in a national movement, someone whose efforts had shaped policies to protect children from bullying in schools, a cause he now realized was more important than any trivial mistake in a workplace report. Judge Harris had always prided himself on being impartial, relying strictly on the law to guide his decisions. He was known for his adherence to protocol and his no-nonsense attitude. But now, for the first time in his career, he questioned whether his approach had been too rigid, too unyielding. Had he considered Angela's life's work before making his decision? Had he taken into account the broader context of her contributions? He couldn't deny that he hadn't. He had been focused solely on the infraction, ignoring the larger picture of who Angela was and what she had done for countless children across the country. The more he thought about it, the more embarrassed he became. He had prided himself on being fair, but had he truly been fair in this case? He had dismissed Angela's explanation, treated her as just another case file in a busy courtroom, without ever pausing to see the person in front of him. He hadn't known the full extent of her advocacy, nor had he made an effort to learn more before delivering his ruling. What if in that moment he had taken a step back and asked himself, Who is this person in front of me? What if he had recognized her as the dedicated advocate for children's well-being that she truly was? Could he have made a different decision, one that reflected the compassion and understanding she deserved? Judge Harris sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the realization. The law was important, yes, but it wasn't everything. The human element, the understanding of who a person truly was and what they stood for, mattered just as much. His initial ruling had been based solely on technicalities, and in doing so, he had missed an opportunity to apply the kind of empathy that could have made all the difference. The more Harris reflected, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about correcting a mistake. It was about doing what was right. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could make things right moving forward. And perhaps, just perhaps, this was the moment that would spark a real change in how he approached every case from then on. Angela sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, though she hadn't really tasted it. The silence of her home felt louder than ever. Her phone buzzed again, and she checked it without much enthusiasm. Another message of support. Another reminder that the world had suddenly become aware of her. She appreciated it, of course. She was grateful for the kindness. But it wasn't easy to accept. It had been a whirlwind few days. The moment her name had hit the headlines, everything had changed. Interviews, phone calls, social media messages. It was overwhelming. She had spent years quietly advocating for kids who had been bullied, and suddenly, her name was associated with a court case about a minor mistake she had made. The attention felt surreal, almost like it wasn't hers at all. Angela wasn't used to being in the public eye. She had never wanted it. She had always believed that her work spoke for itself, that the kids she helped, the teachers she trained, the policies she influenced would be her legacy. That was enough. But now, with the whole world watching, she found herself questioning her own motives. Was this a moment to finally speak out more boldly about the systemic issues she'd long seen in education? Or should she continue to keep her head down and stay focused on the work, just as she had always done? The media frenzy had stirred up old fears. Angela's activism had always come from a place of deep personal conviction. Growing up, she had experienced the sting of bullying firsthand. The isolation, the shame, the feeling that no one cared. It had shaped her into the woman she was today, the woman who stood up for the voiceless. But she had never sought recognition for her own struggles. Her work had always been about others. And now, as the spotlight turned onto her, she wondered if her true purpose was being lost in the noise. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from a colleague at the National Bullying Prevention Campaign. It was a message of support, reminding her of why she did what she did. "You're doing great work, Angela," it read. "You've always been the heart of this movement, and no headline will change that." It was comforting, yet it didn't quite ease the weight on her shoulders. She knew she had to keep pushing forward, but the exhaustion was beginning to wear on her. Despite the public outcry about the fine, there was still a part of Angela that struggled with the attention. This wasn't just about the judge anymore. It was about all the personal stories she carried with her. Stories of students, teachers, and families who had trusted her. The fight wasn't over. She had always believed in quiet, steady work, but now, perhaps it was time for her voice to be heard in a way it never had before. But how? How could she balance her quiet advocacy with the need to speak out in this new chapter of her life? She didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain: she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. As the days passed, Angela found herself at the crossroads of a decision she hadn't expected to face. The spotlight she had never asked for now loomed over her, and the media was relentless. News outlets invited her for interviews. Social media platforms were flooded with comments, some supportive, others critical, but all with an intensity that Angela had never imagined. She wasn't sure whether she was ready for this level of attention, but what she did know was that she couldn't ignore it. Her work had always been about giving voice to those who were overlooked, to those who didn't have the platform to speak for themselves. Now she had a chance to use that platform for something much larger than herself. One evening, Angela received an unexpected call. It was from Judge David Harris. She had almost forgotten about him amidst the frenzy of the past week. The last time they'd spoken, he had imposed the fine with little explanation, his face stern and unmoved by her plea. But now, his voice on the other end of the line was softer, almost apologetic. "Ms. Williams," he began, "I've been following the coverage of your work. I didn't realize who you were when I made my ruling. I'm ashamed that I didn't take the time to learn more before passing judgment. What you've done for children, for education, is remarkable. I owe you an apology." Angela was quiet for a moment, unsure how to respond. It was a rare moment of self-awareness from someone who had once seemed indifferent to the context of her life and contributions. She appreciated his apology, but she also knew it didn't erase the impact of his decision. Still, something in his voice told her he had genuinely understood the weight of his actions, and that realization was perhaps the first step toward understanding the broader issues she had been fighting against. "Thank you, Judge," she finally said, her voice steady. "But this isn't about me. It's about how we treat people who aren't always seen for who they really are. You've made a mistake, yes, but it's important that we recognize the systemic issues that allow these things to happen." There was a pause on the other end of the line before he spoke again. "You're right, and I'd like to make it right." The conversation ended on a note of understanding. But for Angela, it was a moment of mixed emotions. She knew this apology was meaningful, but it didn't change the fact that people, especially those in positions of power, had the ability to ignore or dismiss important voices when they didn't fit their preconceptions. Despite this, Angela felt a surge of resolve. The conversation with Judge Harris, though only a small part of the larger picture, marked a shift in her approach to her own role in the movement. Perhaps this was her chance to push the conversation even further, to highlight how society's judgments often fail to see the full story. Angela didn't need an apology to validate her work, but the conversation was a reminder of something crucial. Sometimes, real change began with those willing to admit when they were wrong. And now, more than ever, it was time to use her voice to speak truth to power. The fight for fairness wasn't just about the kids in schools. It was about changing how we all saw one another. The days following Angela's conversation with Judge Harris were filled with reflection and newfound clarity. The apology had given her a sense of closure, but it also sparked a deeper understanding of what was at stake. The world had finally recognized her work, but with that recognition came a heavy responsibility, one she wasn't sure she was ready for. Still, she knew she couldn't back down now. Angela had always believed in quiet change, working behind the scenes, building coalitions, and slowly but surely influencing policy. But the events of the past week had shown her that sometimes the loudest change came not from the work itself, but from the courage to stand up and speak out when things were wrong. It was time to take the next step. Angela knew that her story could spark important conversations about how society often failed to see the contributions of those who didn't fit the traditional mold of what was valued. It was time to expand the conversation from her personal experience to a broader systemic issue: how people, especially women of color, were often overlooked, disregarded, or undervalued. As she prepared for a live interview on one of the country's top morning talk shows, Angela found herself nervous for the first time in a long while. She was used to speaking at conferences or in smaller forums, but this was different. This was national television, but she also knew that the platform could be a chance to further her cause, to make sure that her message about bullying and injustice resonated with a wider audience. She had spent years working with students and educators, but now it was time for her to step out of the shadows and share her truth. On the day of the interview, the studio was bustling with energy, but Angela stood firm in the quiet of her thoughts. When the host introduced her, the camera zoomed in, and for the first time, Angela didn't shrink from the spotlight. She smiled, feeling the weight of the moment settle in her chest, but she stood tall. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a leader, an advocate, and a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. The conversation began with the court case, but Angela quickly shifted the focus to the larger issue at hand. She talked about how systemic biases often affected the lives of people who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, making real, lasting change. She spoke about the challenges faced by those who were pushing for reform, those who were fighting for equality and justice, but often went unrecognized. And she spoke about the students who were still facing bullying, the young people who needed more than just policies. They needed advocates who truly cared. By the end of the interview, Angela had not only shared her story, but she had also sparked a larger conversation about fairness, empathy, and how we value each other in society. The world was now seeing her for what she truly was, a champion for those who had no voice and someone who had the courage to stand up, not just for herself, but for all those who were overlooked. Angela Williams had stepped into the light, and she was ready to lead the charge toward a more just and compassionate world.